Berlin, May 2nd, 1945. The Reich is dying in flames and rubble. Soviet tanks rumble through shattered streets, their treads grinding over broken glass and twisted metal. The hammer and sickle flies over the Reichstag. Victory is inevitable, intoxicating, absolute. Red Army soldiers pose for photographs among the ruins, their faces lit with the euphoria of triumph. But in the chaos of conquest, something else is happening. Something quiet, something deliberate. Among the Soviet officers coordinating the final assault on Berlin is Major General Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov, a name that appears in intelligence briefings but rarely in public records. He wasn't a frontline commander. He didn't lead tank divisions or storm fortifications. His war was fought in shadows, in coded transmissions, in rooms where maps were burned after every meeting. Volkov was NKVD, but not the kind you'd find interrogating prisoners or executing deserters. He was something more specialized. Fluent in German, Polish, and Czech, a trained cryptographer, a strategist who understood not just military objectives, but ideological ones. Documents later unearthed from Soviet archives hint at his involvement in post-liberation consolidation operations, bureaucratic language for ensuring that conquered territory stayed conquered, that certain secrets remained buried, and that certain people simply disappeared. In the final days of the war, as Soviet forces secured Berlin sector by sector, Volkov was reportedly seen in meetings with Smersh operatives and high-ranking political officers. His role was never clearly defined. Even within Stalin's paranoid inner circle, Volkov was an enigma. He gave orders that weren't written down. He coordinated operations that had no official designation. And then, on May 7, 1945, one day before Germany's official surrender, Viktor Volkov vanished. No funeral. No arrest, no record of transfer or demotion, just a signature on a requisition form for a military convoy heading east, and then silence. A silence that would stretch for exactly 80 years. For decades, Volkov's name would surface only in whispers among Cold War historians and former intelligence officers, an invisible thread in a tapestry of Soviet secrets, buried gold, and operations that officially never existed. But even they couldn't agree on one fundamental question. Did Viktor Volkov die in the ashes of Berlin, or was his war only just beginning? May 6, 1945. As the last German resistance crumbles and Soviet forces begin the grim work of occupation, a convoy of 3 military trucks slips quietly out of Berlin under sealed orders. The vehicles carry no unit markings. The men inside wear standard Red Army uniforms, but their papers are stamped with authorization codes that don't appear in any official registry. One of them is Major General Viktor Volkov. According to a fragmentary report discovered in 1991 within the crumbling archives of the former East German Stasi headquarters, Volkov had been issued emergency relocation orders. Destination, undisclosed. Purpose, classified under Protocol Zima, Winter Protocol. The convoy's route was deliberately circuitous, threading through Soviet-controlled Poland, then south through Czechoslovakia, avoiding major roads and military checkpoints. But somewhere in the Tatra Mountains, along the border between Czechoslovakia and Poland, the trail goes completely cold. No radio communications, no sightings at Soviet border posts, no accident reports. 3 trucks carrying approximately 15 men simply vanish into the mountain fog like smoke dissipating in wind. Weeks later, a Polish partisan unit stumbles upon an abandoned Soviet transport vehicle near the village of Zakopane. The engine is cold. The doors hang open. Inside, they find military rations, encrypted codebooks with pages torn out, a blood-stained topographical map marked with symbols that match no known Soviet designation system, and a single spent bullet casing. No bodies, no dog tags, no explanation. The partisan commander reports the discovery to Soviet military authorities. He is thanked for his diligence, told the matter will be investigated, and never contacted again. The truck disappears from the impound lot 3 days later. The report vanishes from official records. For decades, nothing else surfaces. Volkov's name appears occasionally in declassified NKVD documents, always in fragments, always redacted. Family members are told he died heroically in the final assault on Berlin. No grave is provided, no pension is claimed. His military file, when researchers finally gain access to it in 1997, contains exactly 4 pages. Most of it is blacked out, and yet, rumors persist. In small mountain villages scattered across southern Poland and northern Slovakia, locals whisper of strange occurrences in the years immediately following the war. Unusual radio signals coming from high elevations. Soviet military personnel seen in areas with no official bases or installations. A forester's son remembers his father returning from the high trails in 1947, pale and shaken, speaking of voices in Russian, echoing from somewhere deep within an unmapped ravine. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, just enough to keep the myth alive. Because Viktor Volkov wasn't just another Soviet officer who disappeared in the fog of war. He was the man who vanished with purpose. And what no one could explain, not even now, was why. The Tatra Mountains, 1946 to 1950. For those who lived in the shadow of the Tatra Range, the war never truly ended. The gunfire faded. The German occupation gave way to Soviet liberation. Flags changed. But something lingered in the forests. Something that made shepherds quicken their pace at dusk and hunters turn back before reaching certain ridges. They said the mountains remembered things the world had chosen to forget. It always started the same way. Strange lights deep in the forest, flickering not like fire, not like electricity, something in between. Then came the sounds. Short bursts of static, mechanical clicks that echoed through valleys with no visible source. And occasionally, voices. Russian voices. Too clear to be the wind. Too purposeful to be memory. In villages like Zakopane, Javorina, and Zdr, people began to speak quietly, cautiously, about the man in the high place. A figure some claimed to have seen watching from distant ridges through binoculars. Always alone, always at dawn or dusk. Children whispered about the Red Ghost, a faceless Soviet officer who lived in a stone house hidden by snow and time. Adults dismissed it as mountain folklore, a blend of trauma and superstition, but even they bolted their doors earlier in winter. Some said it was just deserters, broken soldiers from various armies who had refused to surrender, surviving in caves or abandoned shepherd huts. Others believed it was something more calculated, a secret installation, a listening post monitoring Western intelligence movements through the newly formed Iron Curtain. One persistent tale involved a Slovak woodcutter, who in the autumn of 1948 stumbled upon what he described as a reinforced metal door built into the mountainside, camouflaged with rocks and moss. He claimed that when he approached, he heard movement inside, the scrape of furniture, the click of a bolt-action rifle being loaded. He ran. When he returned the next day with his brother, the door was gone. The rock face appeared undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. No official report was filed. He left the region 6 months later and never spoke of it again. Whether truth or myth, one name always seemed to float to the surface of these stories like oil on water. Volkov. Major General Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov. The man who vanished. The man the mountains never gave back. The 1960s to 1990s. The Cold War years. By the 1960s, the story of Viktor Volkov had morphed from intelligence mystery to Cold War legend. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was folklore, the kind that lived in classified memos, conspiracy theories, and late-night conversations between intelligence officers who still remembered how close the world had come to nuclear annihilation. But for a few, the case never went cold. It calcified, hardened into obsession. Western intelligence agencies combed through defector testimonies and intercepted communications. Some were convinced Volkov had been executed during one of Stalin's paranoid purges in the late 1940s. His disappearance merely a bureaucratic cover for internal liquidation. Others believed he had been deep cover, perhaps sent to establish a clandestine network in Western Europe under a false identity. But Volkov's name never surfaced in any defector debriefings. Not once. That was unusual. Men of his rank didn't just vanish without someone, somewhere, knowing something. In 1973, a British journalist named Edward Holloway traveled to Poland and Slovakia, filming a documentary on Soviet occupation and its lasting effects. His crew interviewed elderly villagers, explored abandoned military installations, filmed old bunkers and forgotten outposts. In one segment, never aired, an old woman speaks in broken English about the Russian who lived in the mountain. When pressed for details, she becomes agitated and refuses to continue. The documentary aired once on BBC Two, then disappeared from the archives. Holloway refused all interviews about it afterward. A Soviet historian named Dr. Anatoly Grekov published a paper in 1987 claiming Volkov had been part of a failed conspiracy against Stalin and was executed in secret during the post-war purges. But when Western researchers attempted to verify his sources after the fall of the Soviet Union, they found nothing but forged documents and disconnected phone numbers. Over time, the world moved on. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. New secrets eclipsed old ones. But Volkov lingered in the margins, notorious in silence. In 2003, a Polish university funded a digital project to track missing Soviet officers from World War II. Volkov's file was labeled Status Nizhny, unknown. No grave, no death certificate, no fingerprints. Just a list of qualifications, a handful of operational codes, and a final destination no one ever confirmed. Eventually, even the researchers gave up. The funding dried up. The Cold War was over. Governments stopped looking. And the forest, indifferent as ever, kept its secret. But stories have a way of surviving where records fail. And when a hiker wandered off that ridge 80 years later and saw something that shouldn't exist, he wouldn't just stumble upon an old military shelter. He would tear a hole straight through history. June 14th, 2025. It was supposed to be a photography expedition, nothing more than a quiet escape from the noise of modern life. Tomasz Kowalski, a 38-year-old civil engineer from Krakow, was following an unmarked trail above the tree line in the high Tatras. Camera equipment slung across his shoulders, breath thin in the alpine air. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just solitude. A few hours of silence. 3 hours into the ascent, he veered west into a steep, narrow gorge rarely visited by hikers. The terrain was treacherous, unstable scree and loose rock. That's when he saw it. Just above a granite outcrop, half buried beneath decades of alpine debris, was something that didn't belong. A section of corroded metal protruding from the earth at an unnatural angle. Weathered, military green beneath the rust. At first he thought it might be wreckage from a downed aircraft, but as he cleared away the moss and soil, he realized the metal was part of something larger, something deliberate. A ventilation shaft, reinforced with Soviet-era riveting patterns. His heart rate spiked. He took photographs, marked the GPS coordinates, and within 6 hours, he was sitting in a Polish military intelligence office in Zakopane, watching stone-faced officers examine his images in complete silence. Within 48 hours, the site was cordoned off. Polish military historians, structural engineers, and forensic experts were flown in. The press was kept at a distance. Initial statements described it only as a structure of historical interest requiring further investigation. But the truth would prove far stranger. What Tomasz Kowalski had found wasn't a bunker, and it wasn't empty. Hidden beneath 80 years of ice, rock, and carefully cultivated obscurity was a sealed world, untouched since the day its door last closed. What the mountains had hidden for nearly 8 decades was not just a ruin. It was a secret waiting to be exhumed. And inside, something was still waiting to be found. Something that had no business surviving the end of the war. The excavation. June 2025. The excavation began quietly. No media circus, no press conferences. Just a rotating crew of alpine engineers and military forensic specialists operating under strict operational security protocols. The site was structurally compromised, partially collapsed, and perched dangerously above a ravine prone to rock slides. It took 9 days to stabilize the site and safely access what was quickly identified as an underground installation, reinforced with concrete and Soviet-standard military construction techniques. Not a bunker designed for defense, but something stranger. A long-term habitation structure built for survival and concealment. The entrance was a reinforced steel hatch, rusted but intact, sealed from the inside. When engineers finally cut through, they found a narrow staircase descending approximately 4 meters into a chamber, roughly the size of a small apartment. The air inside was stale, cold, preserved by the mountain's eternal chill. But it wasn't empty. The main chamber was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized. A table bolted to the floor, a kerosene lamp, a narrow cot with a wool blanket still folded at the foot. Along one wall, wooden shelves held rows of tinned food, labeled in Russian with expiration dates from 1946 and 1947, medical supplies in glass bottles, a small stove, radio equipment, and in the far corner, partially covered by a military-issue canvas tarp, was a body, seated upright in a wooden chair, arms resting on the armrests, as if waiting. Mummified by the cold and low humidity, the figure was nearly intact. The clothing was unmistakably Soviet military. A greatcoat, wool trousers, boots still laced. When forensic specialists carefully removed the coat, they found a leather wallet in the inner pocket. Inside, a faded photograph of a woman and a young boy, a military identification card, and a small red booklet bearing the insignia of the NKVD. The name on the card, Major General Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov. The press was notified within 72 hours. Historians from across Europe were summoned. DNA verification would follow. But within military and intelligence circles there was little doubt. After 80 years the ghost had a body. But the real mystery wasn't that Volkov had survived the war. It was what he had been doing in that mountain, alone, for so long. Because scattered throughout the chamber were documents, maps, journals, and encrypted codebooks. Evidence not of a man hiding from defeat, but of a man waiting for orders that never came. A war that didn't end in 1945. It simply went underground. The body. Forensic analysis. The body was airlifted to Warsaw under military escort. The Institute of Forensic Research handled the remains with extreme care. Temperature-controlled transport, hermetically sealed containers, zero exposure to fluctuating humidity. Though partially mummified, the preservation was extraordinary. The cold hadn't just slowed decomposition, it had essentially suspended it. Tissue samples were taken. Bone marrow was extracted. Dental records, though scarce, were compared against what little remained in fragmentary Soviet military archives. But the breakthrough came from a living connection. In 2019, a woman named Katya Volkova, a retired schoolteacher living in St. Petersburg, had submitted her DNA to a genealogy database, curious about her family's murky history. Her grandfather had been a Soviet officer who died during the war, but no one in the family had ever seen a grave or death certificate. When mitochondrial DNA from the mountain remains was compared against her sample, the result was irrefutable. 99.91% certainty. The man in the mountain was Major General Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov. What followed wasn't celebration, it was a shift in tone. The mystery had changed shape. This was no longer about a man who disappeared. It was about a man who had chosen not to return. The autopsy revealed no signs of trauma, no gunshot wounds, no blunt force injuries, no obvious cause of death. There were faint traces of cardiac tissue degradation, suggesting heart failure, possibly exacerbated by extreme isolation, malnutrition, and the psychological toll of prolonged solitude. Time of death was estimated between late 1949 and early 1950. He had survived the war, survived 4 to 5 years alone in that frozen chamber, long enough for his rations to dwindle, long enough for the world outside to change completely, long enough for the Soviet Union to solidify its grip on Eastern Europe and for the Cold War to begin in earnest. But why stay? Why let the war end around him without ever emerging? No one hides for 5 years in a self-built tomb unless they believe there's still something to fear, or something to wait for. The answers lay not in the bones, but in what was found beside them. Pages not yet read, codes not yet broken, and a journal waiting to speak after 80 years of silence. The artifacts, evidence of intent. Inside a military-issue metal footlocker stored beneath the cot, investigators found what they had been hoping for and what they feared most. Dozens of items, each one a relic of deliberate preparation. Military maps with cryptic annotations, stacks of Soviet rubles bundled with wire, several sets of forged identity papers bearing different names and fabricated birthplaces, and a journal, thick, bound in leather, sealed with a corroded metal clasp. It belonged to Volkov. His name was inscribed on the first page, dated April 29, 1945. Each entry was precise, methodical, written in a disciplined hand that rarely wavered. The opening pages detailed his extraction from Berlin, coded references to safe routes, protocols, and contingency orders. Later entries grew darker. He writes of silence, of isolation, of encrypted radio frequencies that broadcast only static. Then, halfway through the journal, one page was folded, marked with a red star drawn in ink. The date, May 9, 1945, the day after Germany's official surrender. The writing on that page was different. Hurried, almost frantic. No contact from Moscow. Transmission protocols compromised. Operation Zima remains active. I await further instruction. If silence persists beyond 60 days, protocol endurance is in effect. I will remain in position. The state does not abandon its soldiers. The state does not forget. Beneath that, a final line, underlined twice. They think the war is over. They are wrong. The discovery sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. What was Operation Zima? The term didn't appear in any declassified Soviet military records, not in any known NKVD operation, not in any post-war intelligence summary. Something else, a contingency, a failsafe. The journal offered no further explanation, but in another crate investigators found the remnants of a sophisticated shortwave radio transmitter. It had been heavily modified, calibrated to frequencies used by Soviet long-range encrypted communications. Near it, vacuum tubes, spare parts, a handwritten frequency log covering dates from May 1945 to September 1949. He had been trying to reach someone, or waiting for someone to reach him. The maps told their own story, markings across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and even parts of Yugoslavia. Circles drawn around remote locations, caves, abandoned structures, forgotten mountain passes, places that could hide more than one man. Among the final pages of the journal was a list of names, some crossed out, others untouched, each name followed by a code designation. One of them read, Berezin, Ledova Straj, Ice Watch. The chamber wasn't just a hideout, it was a station, a listening post, a node in a network that might have stretched across the newly forming Iron Curtain, an embassy from a war that refused to die quietly. The final entry, November 3rd, 1949. The final entry in Viktor Volkov's journal is dated November 3rd, 1949. The handwriting is shakier than in earlier entries, the letters less controlled, as if written by a hand weakened by cold, hunger, or despair, but the words are legible. And what they reveal is not just the closing thoughts of a dying man, but a mission unfulfilled. I was never meant to write this record. The order was verbal, direct, not for archives. That sentence opens the entry, underlined once. It sets the tone immediately. This wasn't reflection, it was confession. Operation Zima failed to proceed to Phase 2. All channels silent since August 1947. No acknowledgement code, no extraction. I am operationally isolated. That is my security. That is also my prison. Volkov writes in fragments using military shorthand mixed with personal observations. But one term repeats throughout. Zima. Winter. He refers to it not as a mission but as a directive. Something preordained by what he calls the apparatus behind the apparatus. Language eerily reminiscent of deep state paranoia or intelligence compartmentalization. I was not betrayed. We were all betrayed by circumstance. Our role was terminal, to be the roots of the structure, not its visible growth. We were never meant to return. We were to remain, silent, until the ground was ready, until memory became myth, until the West forgot to look. Then he names names. Not many, but enough. Berezin, Ledova Straj, Ice Watch, Dernov, Tichy Bod, Silent Point, Korsakov, Hranichnik, Border Sentinel. Each name is associated with a function, communications, logistics, observation. Some are underlined, some are crossed out violently. Operation Zima was never about victory. Berlin was already gone. We knew it. That is why we were chosen. Not to fight, to remain, to wait for the thaw, to be the ember that never dies. The most chilling lines come near the end, where Volkov seems to acknowledge what his silence has cost him. I no longer believe extraction is coming, but I also do not believe I am alone. We were too many, too careful, too committed. They will emerge, somewhere, someday, when the state calls. And then the last line, scratched across the bottom of the page like a warning or a prayer. The snow remembers what Moscow forgets. The journal ends there. No signature, no farewell, just an echo from a man who believed he had vanished into purpose. But what was Operation Zima really? And how many others had vanished into its frozen silence? Operation Zima, the network. Until the chamber's discovery, the name Zima existed only in fragments. Among Cold War researchers, It was the kind of term that appeared in redacted footnotes, half-burned documents, and whispered conversations between aging intelligence veterans. Now, with Volkov's journal in hand, investigators had something unprecedented. Proof the operation was real. Declassified Western intelligence files from 1947 and 1948 revealed a troubling pattern. Intercepted Soviet communications referencing winter sleepers, Alpine reserves, and Phase II continuity networks. A CIA field report from 1949, previously dismissed as speculative, noted evidence suggests secondary NKVD network, possibly designated Winter Protocol, intended to establish deep-cover observation posts across contested frontiers. The theory was dismissed at the time as Cold War paranoia. After all, the Soviets had won. Why would they need sleeper agents in their own occupied territories? But the term Zima translates directly to winter, a word that carries deep symbolic weight in Russian culture and Soviet military doctrine. In intelligence terminology, it suggested something dormant, something designed to survive a long freeze and activate only when conditions were right. These weren't agents infiltrating the West. They were men chosen to disappear into Soviet-controlled or neutral territory, to remain silent and vigilant, to observe without acting. The theory grew darker. If Operation Zima was real, then Volkov's chamber wasn't an anomaly. It was a node, a waiting post, one of many. A team of Polish and Slovak archivists, working in coordination with newly opened KGB successor agency files, discovered a 1944 topographical survey marked Specialnoye Nazначение, special purpose, referencing 6 potential fallback installations embedded in mountainous, difficult-to-access terrain. One was located near the Czech-German border. Another matched the exact coordinates where Volkov's chamber was found. These weren't bunkers designed for battle. They were observation posts designed to be invisible, built to last for decades, populated by men handpicked not for their combat skills but for their patience, loyalty, and willingness to vanish. Operation Zima, it seemed, wasn't about escape or survival. It was about hibernation, a contingency plan for a future that never arrived, or perhaps one that still might. Because if one chamber was found, what about the others? Life in isolation, the waiting years. There is no evidence Volkov ever left the chamber once he sealed himself inside. The supplies he brought, meticulously inventoried in a separate ledger found beside the radio, had been rationed with military precision, each item logged with dates, quantities, and consumption notes. He had prepared to wait. But for how long? His journal entries grew increasingly sparse after 1947. The confident, disciplined observations of 1945 were replaced by shorter, more philosophical reflections. Notes about the cold, about rationing water, about the silence of the shortwave bands. One line repeats throughout the later pages like a mantra. The state does not forget its soldiers. The transmitter had been used extensively. Forensic analysis of the equipment revealed burn marks consistent with prolonged, repeated operation. Investigators believe Volkov may have broadcast coded signals nightly for months, perhaps years, sending pulses into static, hoping someone, somewhere, was still listening. Yet even as the world outside rebuilt, even as Stalin's purges intensified, even as the Iron Curtain descended and the Cold War began, Volkov didn't emerge. He didn't defect. He didn't flee. His purpose wasn't survival. It was obedience. There were indications he remained active into at least 1949. A handmade calendar tacked to the wall was marked through October. Below it, a torn page from the journal dated October 28th. I remain. No orders received. Position secure. Transmission protocols compromised or abandoned. Faith intact. If Moscow has forgotten, then I am the memory. After that, the pages stop. No record of illness. No farewell. The last dozen pages of the journal are blank. The silence is louder than any encrypted message. A man who had documented everything, who tracked every calorie, every frequency, every atmospheric change, simply stopped writing. Some believe Volkov succumbed to heart failure or hypothermia. Others think he made a final choice, his mission complete or shattered by the unbearable weight of isolation. But the way the chamber was left, meticulously organized, journal sealed, pistol untouched beside his body, suggests a man still waiting even in death. Whatever Operation Zima was meant to be, Volkov believed in it until his last breath. And that belief might not have died with him, because what investigators found next suggested something far bigger than one man and one mountain. The maps. A network revealed. Beneath a false bottom in Volkov's storage locker, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with military tape, investigators uncovered a bundle of documents that would redefine the entire investigation. Maps, notes, and a hand-drawn grid system sketched on aged parchment. The grid was crude but deliberate. Lines and topographical markers scattered across Central and Eastern Europe. The symbols were unmistakable. Triangles, circles, crosses. Each was numbered. Some circled in red, others violently scratched out. Overlaid with modern satellite maps, the implications became undeniable. These were not natural landmarks. They were positions, potential coordinates of installations like Volkov's, hidden posts, caches, escape routes, not all in Poland. Some extended into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and even the Carpathian Mountains of Ukraine. More names appeared in the margins, code names most likely. Vostok, Ledovech, Tichy, Pranice. 7 of the names had been crossed out with heavy black ink. 9 remained untouched. What did the markings mean? Had these individuals died, been compromised, or had they successfully completed their mission and moved on? Also among the papers was a list labeled Perechodnie Toczki, transition points. These appeared to be covert routes between key locations. One was later identified as a disused railway tunnel sealed after a 1946 landslide. Another matched an area near the Slovak-Ukrainian border, where villagers reported seeing Soviet military vehicles traveling at night long after the war ended. One document, barely legible and written in a simple substitution cipher Volkov had used earlier in his journal, contained a phrase repeated 4 times. Led derzit. The ice holds. No context. No explanation. Just those words. Historians and intelligence analysts now believe Operation Zima may have included a network of winter watchers, men like Volkov, embedded in isolation across Soviet-controlled or neutral territory, tasked with waiting, observing, and maintaining the capability to report or activate when called. A parallel chain of operatives buried not in enemy territory, but in silence and snow, beyond the reach of conventional oversight. If even one other installation still existed, if even one of those names still corresponded to a living operative or their descendants, the implications would fundamentally challenge what we thought we knew about the post-war Soviet intelligence apparatus. Because Volkov didn't just vanish, he was stationed and he wasn't meant to be alone. The villagers, memory, and testimony. Long before excavation teams arrived, before DNA tests and press conferences, the villagers in the valleys below already had a name for that part of the mountain. Ciche Szczyty, the silent peaks. It was a place avoided more by instinct than fear, where the trees grew too dense and the silence felt unnatural. Investigators interviewed anyone old enough to remember the immediate post-war years. What they found were fragments, half-memories, folk warnings passed down like ghost stories. One man, Józef Mazur, now 91, remembered his father's words from when he was a boy in 1948. Don't go near the high gorge. The Russian sleeps there. At the time, he thought it was nonsense, a story to keep children from dangerous cliffs. But he also remembered his father coming back from a hunting trip, pale and silent, muttering about hearing Russian songs echoing from somewhere deep in the rocks. Another woman, Helena Kovac, a retired midwife now in her late 80s, claimed she once saw a man in a Soviet greatcoat filling water containers from a mountain spring in the winter of 1947. He didn't speak. He just looked at me. His eyes were empty, like he was already a ghost. Some villagers spoke of finding boot prints in the snow that led nowhere. Others remembered faint mechanical humming at night, rhythmic, like a generator or radio equipment operating on a distant ridge. None of it was reported. None of it documented. In post-war Poland, under Soviet occupation, people learned quickly that asking questions was more dangerous than staying silent. But when photos of the chamber were released, and Volkov's face, a face not seen since 1945, appeared in newspapers across Europe, many in those mountain villages said only one thing: we always knew something was up there. And quietly, in private conversations away from cameras, a few elderly residents confessed something even stranger, that they were never entirely sure he had been alone. The aftermath, closure, or opening, the discovery didn't just make headlines, It shattered assumptions. Military historians, archivists, and retired intelligence officers scrambled to re-examine decades of Cold War doctrine. The body of Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov was no longer a question. It was an answer. But to what exactly remained disturbingly unclear. For some it was closure. Another Soviet mystery solved. Another ghost laid to rest. Museums in Moscow and Warsaw requested the chamber's artifacts for preservation. Academic journals published papers debating whether Operation Zima was a legitimate deep state program or the delusion of a loyalist who couldn't accept the war's end. But others weren't convinced. Intelligence officials in Poland, Slovakia, and quietly within successor agencies to the KGB, reopened long-dormant files. Requests were made through back channels to examine archives still sealed in Moscow. And beneath the surface of diplomatic niceties, a new kind of unease began to circulate. Because if Volkov had survived undetected for years, isolated but operational, who else might have? In online forums and fringe podcasts, the speculation ignited. Operation Zima was no longer myth. It was real, and the mountain silence had just cracked open. Some called it an unfinished contingency plan. Others feared it might have been an active one, waiting not for orders, but for the right moment. The Polish government responded swiftly. The site was sealed. No public access. Excavation teams rotated under military supervision. Independent researchers were denied entry. Officially, this was to preserve the structural integrity of a fragile historical site. Unofficially, it was to prevent what one internal memo called uncontrolled dissemination of sensitive Cold War operational details with potential contemporary security implications. In nearby towns, tourists began arriving. True crime enthusiasts, Cold War history buffs, conspiracy theorists. But the locals didn't speak. They watched. They remembered. Because for them, it wasn't news. It was confirmation. And confirmation, in the Tatras, is never comforting. Epilogue. Snow falls softly now over the ruins, erasing the outlines of what once was. The chamber, what remains of it, is little more than steel, stone, and silence, a monument to patience that outlasted hope. The excavation tents are gone. The soldiers rotated out. The lights turned off. No plaque marks the spot. No memorial stands for Major General Viktor Sergeyevich Volkov. He vanished in 1945, believing the war was not over but merely paused. He died waiting for a signal that never came, for a state that may have forgotten him or perhaps never intended to remember. And maybe that's the most haunting part. Not that he was abandoned, but that he might have been exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was told, waiting in the cold while the world moved on without him. No answers, just the weight of history settling back into the frozen earth. And somewhere beneath the snow, in mountains that stretch across borders and decades, the ghost of a soldier still watches, still waits, still believes that one day the signal will come, that the ice will break, that Operation Zima will finally awaken from its long winter sleep. But until that day, if it ever comes, the mountains keep their secrets, the wind carries no answers, and the snow continues to fall, burying the past deeper with each passing year. This story was chilling. But the next one is even more terrifying.